Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 24th Annual Winter Words Author Series. I'm Carolyn Torrey, Managing Director at Aspen Words. And for those of you new to us tonight, we're a Colorado-based literary arts nonprofit and program of the Aspen Institute. For the first time in Winter Words history, we have people tuning in from 42 different states and multiple countries. During this time of isolation, stories can connect us to the world and to each other, and we thank you for being a part of that tonight, for purchasing tickets and season passes and donating and helping to create this literary community with us. I'll be going over a few quick housekeeping items and thank yous before turning it over to my colleague, Adrienne Brodeur, who will introduce Isabel Wilkerson and Elizabeth Alexander. We'll be using the chat feature to post links to additional reading and information throughout the event. So make sure you pop that up on your screen. And if you'd like to purchase books by tonight's speakers or any of the other Winter Words authors, you can visit our bookshop.org shelf with sales benefiting our local indie Explore booksellers here in Colorado. We've set aside the last few minutes of tonight's hour-long talk for audience questions. You can submit those anytime using the Q&A feature in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, and I'll pop back in at the end to help facilitate that Q&A. We have several longtime and new partners who've helped make this season possible, so please send your applause into the virtual universe while I thank them. Our season presenting sponsors are Beth and Josh Mondry and Helen and Wally Obermeyer. Thank you to our media partner, the Aspen Times, and our grantors at the City of Aspen and Les Dames d'Aspen. And new this year, a very special thanks to our lead corporate sponsor, Book of the Month. Before I turn it over to Adrienne for introductions, we're delighted to share a brief video message from Book of the Month.
I really look forward to getting mine every month.
Okay.
I just started mine.
Dude, me too. We're synced.
You still get it, Grandma?
Sure do.
It's so heavy. I cried. It's happening again.
I'd invite you up, but I just got my Book of the Month.
Book of the Month. Choose from 5 new books and get your favorite delivered to you monthly.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Adrienne Brodeur, Executive Director of Aspen Words. Thank you, Book of the Month, for that spot of levity, for supporting Winter Words, and for connecting great books to readers everywhere. Now, I can think of no better way to launch this year's Winter Words series than with these two fierce and brilliant women. It is my honor to introduce first Isabel Wilkerson, the author of Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. Caste is one of those rare, paradigm-shifting, open your eyes to the truth type of books. Miss Wilkerson has won a Pulitzer Prize, the National Humanities Medal, and is a leading figure in narrative nonfiction, an interpreter of the human condition, and an impassioned voice for demonstrating how history can help us better understand ourselves. Caste has been described as the missing puzzle piece of our nation's history, inviting readers to examine constructed notions of race, class, and gender. It is also my distinct honor to introduce our distinguished moderator, Dr. Elizabeth Alexander, a poet, educator, memoirist, scholar, cultural advocate, and president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the nation's largest funder in arts and culture and humanities in higher education. Dr. Alexander is also a chancellor of the Academy of American Poets, serves on the Pulitzer Prize board, and co-designed the Art for Justice Fund. Notably, she composed and delivered Praise Song for the Day for the inauguration of President Barack Obama in 2009. She is the author or co-author of 14 books. Her book of poems, American Sublime, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2006, and her memoir, The Light of the World, one of my favorite memoirs of all times, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2015. Caste has been on the bestseller list since it first published, demonstrating exactly how hungry all of us are for this level of deep examination. On behalf of Aspen Words and the Aspen Institute, welcome to you both, and thank you so much for being here.
It is wonderful to be here. Thank you so much, Adrienne, and welcome, Isabel. It is so wonderful to be here with you.
I'm delighted.
Well, we have many, many, many things to talk about in this extraordinary book, and in this extraordinary book alongside your body of work. So I wanted to start by asking you first, and also by saying the writerliness, the writerly beauty of Caste, the sort of genre defyingness of Caste, which I'd love to talk about later. It's got hardcore historian work, it's got hardcore social science work, there's allegory, there are personal stories, there are pithy philosophical meditations. So it is a book of many voices, and I would love to ask you to start by reading a section of your choice.
Okay, thank you. Again, it's such an honor to be here, and virtually or in any other way, I'm just thrilled to be here with you. So the passage I'm reading, it's from the epilogue. Regardless of who prevails in any given election, the country still labors under the divisions that a caste system creates and the fears and resentments of a dominant caste that is too often in opposition to the yearnings of those deemed beneath them. It is a danger to the species and to the planet to have this depth of unexamined grievance and discontent in the most powerful nation in the world. A single election will not solve the problems that we face if we haven't dealt with the structure that created the imbalance to begin with. Mm-hmm. As it stands, the United States is facing a crisis of identity unlike any before. The country is headed toward an inversion of its demographics, with its powerful white majority expected to be outnumbered by people not of European descent within 2 decades. This is unknown territory for everyone in the hierarchy, an ethnic distribution that could potentially look closer to that of South Africa than to what Americans have grown accustomed to. Anticipatory fear seems already to have surfaced, but if history is any guide, a change in demographics might have less of a material effect on the dominant caste than imagined. A 2016 study found that if disparities in wealth were to continue at the current pace, it would take Black families 228 years to amass the wealth that white families now have, and Latinx families another 84 years to reach parity. Thus, as in South Africa, there would be no reason to believe that economic, social, and in America, political dominance would not still remain in the hands of those who have held it for the entirety of the country's history. This will be a test of the cherished ideal of majority rule, the moral framework for caste dominance in America since its founding. White dominance has already been assured by the inherited advantages of the dominant caste in most every sphere of life and of governing, from gerrymandered districts to voter suppression to the electoral college, which favors the dominant caste, whatever the numbers. Will the United States adhere to its belief in majority rule if the majority does not look as it has throughout history? This will be a chance for America either to further entrench its inequalities or to choose to lead the world as the exceptional nation that we have proclaimed ourselves to be.
Thank you. And I should add to the genres, the sermon. That had me making noises as I was listening to you preach the sermon of this very moment.
Yeah.
Of this very moment. So, I mean, you've taken us, you've situated us at this crossroads, and I think that, or a potential crossroads, let's say. And I think that you've brought us there now, but that's also where the book has taken us. Right there. Can you say more about what you chose to read, reading it tonight, where we stand?
Well, I wanted to read it because essentially this is again from the epilogue, and that means that by the time a reader has arrived at this passage, they have been fully immersed in this phenomenon, the phenomenon of caste, and the reader now realizes the stakes and the gravity of the situation of this reckoning. By this time, the reader has felt the full weight of the history we've inherited. And the reader knows by this time that we must understand this if we are to transcend it. And this was written, by the way, before the election, clearly, but it's written with an awareness that it would be true because of the enduring nature of the caste system.
And you, of course, you also set us up. I mean, the book is not only organized around elections, but you have some scenes previous to the 2016 election, where you're beginning to think about how to read the country in the terms that you lay out for us in this book. And so I would love for you to talk about the choice of caste, the term, the choice of caste that can carry race and other categories with it, but is not what you might expect race.
Well, you know, I came to the use of the term caste through the first book, The Warmth of Those Suns, in which, you know, as you know, it was about the out-migration, the defection, really, of 6 million African Americans from the South to all points in the rest of the country. And in doing so, I was, you know, charged with, you might say, describing what it was that they were fleeing. I mean, why did 6 million people evacuate the Jim Crow South during much of the 20th century? And in doing so, I was, you know, describing, recreating, you might say, the world that they were forced to flee. And in doing so, I realized that the term racism, which is a significant and important way of understanding aspects of our country's history, but racism alone did not seem to capture the depth of control, the totalitarian, authoritarian impulses, the depth of control of the boundaries, the effort to remind at every step, every moment of one's life, a reminder of the hierarchy, and a reminder that any breach of that hierarchy could literally mean your life, a matter of life and death. I mean, this is a world where it was against the law for Black people and white people to merely play checkers again in Birmingham. It was a world where in courtrooms throughout the South, there was actually a Black Bible and an altogether separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth on in court. That meant that you know, the very word of God was segregated. That's how seriously they took this, you know, hallmark of caste, which is purity and pollution, which meant that the same sacred object could not so much as be held and touched by hands of different races. So this went beyond, you know, not, you know, prejudice and it's just not liking a group of people or hating a group of people. This went far beyond that. And so, you know, in the process of not only, you know, hearing the testimony of more than 1,200 people who survived the Jim Crow caste system, I also, you know, became aware of and studied the work of anthropologists who had gone into the Jim Crow South during the depth of that regime and had emerged after immersing themselves with it and in participant observation and ethnographies. They emerged using the term caste. They had lived it, they had studied it, they were experts in human interactions, and they emerged with the term caste. And so that's how I came to use the word caste in my own work. And then when I went out talking about The Warmth of the Suns, and of course the many people who read it, it just seemed as if it just sort of rolled into the consciousness. People seemed to just roll with the word. And as I would talk about it, no one was, you know, people truly got it because it was clear that this was a repressive regime. It was so extreme. And of course, this is the birthplace, you know, Virginia was the birthplace of our country. This is the birthplace of the caste system itself. And it, you know, this was the most extreme manifestation of what I'm calling a caste system in our country, which of course had manifestations in the rest of the country. But in the end, what I'm trying to say is that is how I came to use the word caste in my own work. And then that just sort of was the way I began to see the world.
And and also to see the world, because, you know, we have travels where you go deeply into understanding the Indian caste system, where you are thinking deeply about how caste plays out in Germany and Nazi Germany. And between those places and the United States, I think maybe some surprising but fascinating historical connections in those ideologies. That's not a question.
Well, first,
but you could please answer.
well, I would say first I should give you know, what I came to see as the definition of caste as it manifested in these different societies that I chose to focus in on. And so caste essentially is an artificial, arbitrary, graded ranking of human value in a society. It is what determines one's standing, respect, benefit of the doubt that is accorded or withdrawn, access to resources, which again are accorded or denied, assumptions of competence, intelligence, resourcefulness, beauty even. These are accorded a person or withheld from them, regardless of, you know, it has nothing to do with no action on your part is required. These are, you know, these are inherited rankings that have been passed down through the generations from the very founding of our country, where the colonists created, you know, a bipolar system in which they established themselves, the English colonists established themselves as the dominant group, and then decimated the numbers of indigenous people and drove them from their land, and then transported Africans to be enslaved to build the colony and thus the United States out of wilderness. And so doing, with the laws that ensued in Virginia colony and Maryland, that they thus enshrined what would ultimately be a caste system in which everything that you could and could not do was based upon what you look like, where race became the metric by which one's position in the caste system was determined. But caste itself is the underlying architecture of division. It's the underlying infrastructure of division that allows us to see what we have in common, those points of intersection with other societies that have caste hierarchies. And so you mentioned India, and in which purity and pollution is a salient hallmark of that society, in which people assigned to the lowest caste, the subordinated caste, known as untouchables and now known as Dalits, were to many of the people of the lowest caste, and there are many, many castes within caste there, but in any case, those at the bottom were to remain as many as 96 paces away from those in the dominant or upper caste. They of course could not use the wells, the common wells that were used by the dominant caste. This idea of water, the sacred nature of water, of this, you know, element of life itself, was strictly controlled and kept separate in each of these systems that I looked at. And of course, you know, I looked at India, which was the oldest caste system, you know, on a planet really. And then of course, looking at Nazi Germany, which was a compressed 12-year reign of terror, in which they applied many of the hallmarks of a caste system in building up the Third Reich. And they, across time and across space, across oceans, all three of them had a fixation with purity and pollution, with water as one of the main ways of setting a boundary, so that the Germans, the Aryans would keep the Jewish people from being able to use the waters, the pools and the beaches that the Aryans were using. And in our own country, you know, throughout the country, not only in the South, pools and beaches and waterways that were designated for the dominant group, meaning white people, were strictly prohibited from African Americans. Black people were prohibited from using them. And these were matters of life and death. In Chicago, for example, in 1919, a young teenager happened to wade into what was seen as the white water, whatever that means, because the water looks the same, but there was a dividing line, and he happened to wade into what was seen as the white water, and he was stoned to death for having done so. And this set off, you know, one of the riots, race riots of 1919, the Red Summer. And so these things, any breach of the caste system in any of these three societies could mean your very life.
And as I listen to you speak, I think about the perverse imagination of caste, the perverse interest in the details of language and symbols, a Black Bible, a white Bible, 96 steps, this different bodies of water. You have a whole chapter where you talk about the enduring symbols of caste in the United States in the Confederate monuments. And that is really some chapter, because you juxtapose the hundreds of Robert E. Lees in statues and in other kinds of public spaces with a conversation about Germany and the swastika as an outlawed symbol, no statues venerating Hitler and so forth. Could you talk more about, first of all, just why that difference in those two societies, your theories, and also about the power of those material symbols?
Well, there are lots of reasons, and that could be a whole conversation, a separate conversation. And I want to, I just want to express my gratitude and admiration for the monument project that you're doing, the Monuments Project, which is massive and important and necessary, and it's something that will be moving us forward. With these questions, I just think it's the time. It could not be more timely, and I'm just so just so amazed and admiring of the fact that you've taken that on. The histories are very different. I mean, all of these three societies are very, very different. There are these points of intersection, and this is a place where it diverges. I mean, one of the reasons it diverges is because that was a compressed 12-year reign. They were defeated completely in war. They have been spending the decades since that time attempting to atone, reconcile, understand, study, and then also, more importantly, teach young people and everyone in the country what happened. It was a complete and total vanquishing of that system, and they have now converted the places that had been the symbols of Nazism, the places that, the various departments of the Third Reich, they have converted those into museums where people are now, anyone from around the world can now study and learn, walk along those corridors and learn what happened there, so that it will never, ever, ever, ever happen again. There are no symbols, there are no monuments whatsoever to any of the Nazis, none of them. So that there's a complete and total vanquishing of the Third Reich and anything that would elevate them. There is, however, on the other hand, not a wiping out of the history. There is actually a going deep into the history so that it won't happen again. Here we have so far to go because we are not on the same page as a country. We're not on the same page. We're not even on the same page about what we're not on the same page of. I mean, we are so, we are still not nearly enough people really understand or know what happened in the Civil War. People are not even always in agreement of what the cause of the Civil War was. They're certainly not often aware of the meaning of Reconstruction and then what happened afterward. And I can say this as a fact because, when The War for the Sons came out, and I would, go out and talk with people about it, and I would hear people's response to it. And the response that I got over and over and over again was, I had no idea. I would hear that from people, no matter of their background, part of the country that they were from, age. Lots of people would even say, the older people would even say, I had no idea this happened in my lifetime. So that means that, that they did not know basic facts, basic realities about what life was like in a major part of our country in the South, and even in the North, where a lot of people didn't know about redlining and restrictive covenants. I mean, these are facts of life, particularly for people who were born to what I would call the subjugated group, but were unknown to so many other people. And the idea, people say they had no idea. well, not having an idea has consequences. It has consequences in terms of, who people's assumptions about an entire group, but it has consequences on, who people will hire and, where they choose to live and where they choose to send their children and, where they are willing to invest. I mean, all of these things have consequences, of course, how people vote. So these are the ways that not knowing our country's history has real consequences for everyday lives and for the policies and the direction of our country. Whereas in this other country that has really done the hard work of educating people and of interrogating their history, they have, found ways. It doesn't mean that everything's perfect, but it means that they are at least on the same page about what happened in that country.
And so what could, truth and reconciliation look like in a country like this, which is also so big, so diverse, and as you've also, I think, compellingly laid out, so contradictorily and insufficiently educated about our history. What, when you think about truth and reconciliation, what could it look like?
Well, I say in this book that I am presenting to everyone who chooses to read it a report. I'm like the building inspector of the old house, all our country, and I say that the caste system or caste is like the bones and race is the skin. Caste is what we cannot see. Race is the visible manifestation. It's the metric by which people are assigned a space in the hierarchy, going back to the time of enslavement. And so what I say there is that this is an X-ray of our country. You could see me as sort of like a radiologist, and I am presenting the X-ray and describing the X-ray. It's the surgeon who does the actual operation, and so I do not present myself. And I would also say that that people who were born to what was historically the subjugated group in our country is in some ways in the least position, and bears the greatest burden. It's such that that the burden should not be on people from the subordinated group to have all of the answers for a structure that they did not create, and that their ancestors were in fact the targets of, and that they, even today, we live under the shadow of and may be targeted as well. And so I do not present myself as having all the answers, because it took all that I could do to just present this document with a general diagnosis. But I came to the idea of truth and reconciliation as one possible way to approach it. There are many, many, many things that need to happen, because this is a structural problem. It's the infrastructure of our divisions. We don't even use the language in lay terms. I mean, social scientists use the term, but lay people don't use the terms. It's almost like a new concept and language for most of us. And so this is a way of getting us to be able to think differently about what we think we know about our country. The ways that we've been talking about it have not solved all of the problems. Sometimes the ways that we talk about it can obstruct and obscure what we're dealing with. And so I think that the whole point of this is to allow us to see ourselves differently, so that we can find ways to go directly to the infrastructure of a thing, as opposed to what is the physical manifestation. But the idea of truth and reconciliation, if it were to be done well, if it were to be done right, if it were to be done efficiently and effectively, it would force us all to confront and to engage with what has happened before we came on the scene. It would force us to look at where we are, and these are the kind of things that did happen under different names in Germany. They have happened in other places where people have had to really look deep at their history. And if you don't look at the history, then there's no way that you're going to engage with the history, learn from the history, and then you thus find yourself in this loop of not understanding how things happen. I mean, I often say that, we as Americans are like people who walked into a theater in the middle of a movie. And there we are, we see a bus chasing a car, chasing a motorcycle. And, we're looking at it, we're in the middle of the movie. We're like, why is the bus chasing the car, chasing the motorcycle? And none of it makes sense. You can even watch to the end of the movie and it still doesn't make sense, because you didn't catch the first half. And really, that is what history is. History is what happened in the movie before you entered the theater, what happened in the first half before you entered the theater. And so that is what a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if done seriously, if done correctly, if done with seriousness and purpose, then it would force us and allow us all to see what has happened in our country to get us to where we are.
Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be something? The sustained metaphor of the old house is powerfully carried all the way through the book, beginning with, as anyone who has an old house knows, that if you don't attend to something, if you don't figure out the source of something, it's not going to go away. It's not going to go away. And the way that you then bring us to that powerful exchange in the basement, in the leaking basement, in the literal leaking basement, where there is a moment of, I would say, caste confrontation that feels like something different's going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's quite an accomplishment how you do that.
Thank you. I mean, this is something that comes out of the accumulated observations, the depth of thinking that goes into something like this, the tremendous amount of sitting with the research that you've come across, sitting with experiences, listening to people as they describe what they've been through. And of course, all of the travel that had to go along with this. So this ended up all being a distillation of all of that. And that ending, which you're speaking about, which I don't want to spoil for people, it's like the one thing that allows you to. I
stopped myself.
So I will leave that to people to read, but it actually is it's an opening, it's a portal to hopefulness, and shows what can happen even in the seemingly smallest of interchanges. That sort of like that idea about the flap of a butterfly's wing that can then shift the wind off the coast of Africa and then lead to a hurricane. In theory, in our everyday lives, maybe there are ways that we can transcend what seems impossible and to cross those boundaries. And that these things actually can happen. And you think about, I'm not being Pollyannish in any way, that no one would ever call me that, but I do believe that, when we have so many challenges, and these challenges are, economic, they are political, they are having to do with education, our criminal justice system, all systems. And yet, even in the moment, as much as we have yet to do, there are things that an individual can do in the moment that can help shift the wind, if not, overall, but just in our own spaces. And that we all have responsibilities to educate ourselves and then to take the responsibility to make sure that others around us, know. I think the era that we've been in is sort of revealed to us who everyone is around us. I mean, I think a lot of us have discovered, these are the people we're surrounded by. These are the things they believe. And there have been a lot of surprises, I think, for a lot of people in the recent years. But what I think it does is it calls upon us to, take the responsibility within our own lives to see what influence can we have? What influence can we have first on ourselves and on those that are closest to us, and in those openings that might present, and that miracles can happen. I mean, that actually was a miracle.
Well, I have seen when I wanted to talk about the epics that you write, and about your writing process, because you've chosen, an acclaimed journalist for many years, bureau chief at the New York Times in Chicago, and hearing and reporting some of the stories that eventually became a part of, a lead into The Warmth of Other Suns. And that book is an epic. It tells an epic American tale. It has so many voices in it. It crosses the decades. And so too, these many years later, you've not written a small treatise, but rather you've written something that I consider, an epic in its ambition, in its reach, and in the cases of both books, the work that it does for us when it moves around in the world. So I want to talk about the work in the world in a minute, but first I would love to talk about form and moving from journalism and editing and long form into these books.
Well, I have always been a narrative writer. I mean, that's just who I am, and wherever I've been, I work in narrative, and even if the most straightforward hard news story, if it had my byline on it, it was gonna have something narrative in it. If it got cut, just so be it. But a lot of times it didn't get cut, and it would be the thing that would make it on the front page. So. That would lift it onto the front page. So I've always been that person who's always been narratively inclined. So my inclinations were to do this kind of writing. And of course, at the New York Times, most of the stories that I wrote were much longer than most stories would usually run. So I have always been drawn toward long form. And this was a natural progression. This felt very much like an evolution that was sort of an organic moving toward what I had always been inside, which was, narrative writing. I found that, what ends up happening with this kind of work is that, you go out and you find the individuals, or you first figure out what it is that you want to say, and then you find the individuals. I'm always open-minded because I don't know where the people are going to lead me. I have no idea what the story will ultimately be until I find the people for it. I mean, with Warmth of the Suns, I ended up having a casting call. I auditioned people for the role of being protagonists in this book. And in doing so, I had a chance to, hear the testimony of 1,200 people who were my spiritual guides, tour guides through the era that I would be describing. When I was doing Warmth of the Suns, I mean, the choice was, do you go into the archives first, or do you go to the people first? And I'm always the type of person, I mean, no matter what the form is, I'm always looking at the people, because that's where the story is going to be. And that's where the heartbeat of the piece will be, whatever it might be. So that's what I did. And I had the tremendous honor and good fortune to have been able to meet so many people, and had more people than I possibly could have included. In fact, a lot of them are, make cameos in that book. But to settle on those three and to hear their stories, the kind of work that in terms of the writing is really, the writing and the research is all embedded. I would say that with all of the work that I do, it is usually multidisciplinary. I mean, I am calling upon anthropology. Participant observation is a big part of what I do. Sociology, psychology, history, of course, all of these different disciplines to be able to, pull together whatever is necessary in order to tell that narrative. And the work itself is very much like, sewing a quilt. I mean, it's as if I take these fragments of fabric. Some of the fabric I feel I have to weave myself, actually. And then I take these fragments and remnants, and it does not appear in the beginning how it's going to end up. But it takes a bit of faith to know that ultimately, in the end, all of these disparate scraps and remnants of fabric will somehow come together to make this whole. And that's how I approach any of the work that I do, but certainly with these two books, Caste and Warmth of the Suns, that was the approach, and that's just the way that it works for me.
And then they sit on the shelf, they come in the hands, and then they work in the world. I remember when many years ago, when you came with Warmth of Other Suns to New Haven, one of the things that just stayed with me so powerfully was there was an African-American man, probably in his 60s, and he had his very elderly father with him. and his father asked you a question, and he said, we've been reading this book together, and my father never spoke about his migration, and now he won't stop talking about it. That the book opened up the ability for him to talk about the enormity of that story and what it meant. And I just thought that was, and you said at the time, you said pretty much every reading, some version of that happens. So, now we're not able to be with each other in quite the same way, but you are moving around with Caste. And so I would love to know how the audience experience is going.
Well, I wanted to say one other thing that has happened in the time since the visit there at Yale, is that it's really stunning to me that I hear from more people than you would imagine, who will come up to me and they will say that, again, their parent, their grandparent never would talk about it. It was too painful, post-traumatic stress. And that that once they got to a certain point, and many of the people would get very ill, the process of life, and that they would come up to me and they would say that this book, The Warmth of Other Suns, was the last book that their parent, their grandmother, whoever it was reading before they left the planet. And that they would say that brought them a sense of closure, a sense of peace, a sense of having, of being able to put into context what they had suffered. And that it's just an astonishing thing. They come up to me and they say that more times than you would expect, with a sense of gratitude and a sense of completion. And that they say that it allowed them, these sacred moments with their loved one just before they left this planet. And that is just, a tremendous, overwhelmingly powerful thing to hear from someone. And I every time I think about it, I just, get really overwhelmed at the power of that.
Oh my goodness, that is overwhelming. That is overwhelming. Wow. There was here in Caste, one chapter that really flattened me: cortisol, telomeres, and the lethality of Caste. And that is where you talk about, and I wanted to get this very precise, how people of color with more education experience lower life expectancy because they, quote, continually press against the borders of caste. And then what you say is that the caste system and being on its lower rungs certainly takes years off your life, but the contestation with the caste system even more. I've thought about this zone a whole lot across my life, but I had not seen that distinction made so clearly. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, it's really stunning, and it turns out that there are several studies that have made that shocking and in some ways incongruous revelation. Because this is not to say that people who are impoverished do not suffer tremendously in our society. That's not to say that at all. And that people who have had the luxury of being able to get an education and be able to get positions of some influence do not have advantages, that are part of the economy, the way that things work. But what it's to say is that that caste is in some ways a way of sharpening the awareness of what class is. So class allows us to, in some ways, be able to be the marker it's the thing that creates the boundary. It's the thing that sharpens the awareness of what caste actually is. Because when you've accounted for everything else, when you have accounted for, I actually have described caste as the bones, race as the skin, and then class is the, education, the accents, the diction, the clothing, all the other things that we do have control over. And yet, when you have accounted for all of that, when you have factored in all other possible characteristics that could affect how a person is being treated, how they're seen, how they're, what happens to them in this world, then you're left with only one thing, and that is caste, which of course in our country, in other countries, in other societies, the metric may be religion or ethnicity or whatever it may be. In ours, it is phenotype and, one's presumed or declared quote unquote race. And that is the signature of what I'm saying is caste is essentially is nothing more in some ways than policing the boundaries, keeping people in a fixed place. And so when you breach that boundary, when you step out of the place where where people like yourself are expected to be, that is when you're bumping up against caste. You're bumping against the unconscious biases, the unconscious expectations of where an individual should or deserves to be or is worthy of being in our society. And so the people who are more likely to be bumping up against breaching the walls of caste would be those who are stepping outside of the presumed roles that have been in place in our country for longer than they were not. Because we have to all remember that, the mainstreaming of African Americans into the body politic of the country to be able to enter into spheres where they had not been before primarily didn't open up for the masses of African Americans until after the Civil Rights Movement, which was resisted for so long that it actually didn't go into effect until the 1970s. So this idea of African Americans moving into the mainstream and being able to do all of the kinds of things, presumably, that they had been prevented from being able to do before, means that this is all relatively new. This is really relatively new only within a couple of generations. And so within the lifespan of many, many, many people alive today. And so when people are in these positions, professional positions, middle class, upper middle class, they are often more likely to experience the shortening of the telomeres and, higher cortisol levels and higher indicators of stress that's related to being in contention on a regular basis with the assumptions about where people who look like them should be. Class in some ways becomes like the contrast dye that's used to be able to see where the arteries are. When you can see the class allows you to see, oh, this is where they're supposed to be. And this is where they're running into problems because they are not supposed to be there. We can see what happened with one of the greatest breaches in our country's history, you might say, of caste, which was 2008 when we had the first Black president, and we could see the pushback and the resentments that occurred. Someone standing in open, session, of Congress and saying, "You lie." I mean, all of these things that there are many, 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 many ways of cataloging the many unusual shows of disrespect and resistance, because this is not where people are presumed to be, and that's writ large. But of course, in everyday experience of so many people, the health outcomes tell the tale that when you are up against the restrictions that have been embedded over generations, there will be consequences, pushback, and resentments that actually, speak their names on the bodies of people who are having to deal with this on a regular basis.
And so there are a lot of people who want to engage with you in the book. So we're going to turn to a few questions, and but I'll have one thing that I'll want to say at the end, but I want to make sure people have a chance to talk to you.
Okay.
Thank you both so much. That was such a deep and engaging conversation. I could keep listening, but we did, as you said, get a ton of questions from the audience. So we'll try to squeeze in as many of them as we can, and I'll just deliver them over to you. This one is for Isabel and Wilkerson from Rob. And he asks, I'm curious why you picked the 3 caste systems you did. There are many. And there was another question related to this, why the parallels are so strong between the American, Indian, and Nazi caste systems, but maybe not so strong with South African apartheid. Why would this
Oh,
be?
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I considered South Africa, obviously. In fact, when I was at the Times, I was there, for a short time, filling in for the bureau chief at that time. So I had a chance to live in South Africa for a bit. So I absolutely am not only aware of it, but keenly interested in the parallels between the United States and South Africa. One of the reasons that I did not choose to focus on South Africa is because there actually has been quite a bit written about the two countries. A historian, George Frederickson, has spent a tremendous amount of his work on that. And we did seminal work in looking at those two structures. And so I chose not to look at South Africa. I wanted to do 3. India was going to be obvious. There was no question that India, had to be one of the places that I would look. It was so obvious that was the one focus for quite a bit of time. And then Charlottesville happened. And, during what we saw in Charlottesville, we all saw, the convergence of these symbols, the symbols of, the Confederacy, the symbols of the Nazis, merging in the regalia of the protesters who were protesting the possible removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee there in Charlottesville. And so they are the ones who brought these symbols together. I mean, across time and across oceans, they recognized or saw the overlap, the points of intersection. They saw a connection, and they made that connection. And that is what propelled me to look at Germany. It made me want to first look at Germany to see what had they done in the intervening decades after World War II to, reconcile that history, to atone for that history. I mean, I knew a little bit of that, but I really wanted to go deep and understand, how was it that they had done that? I also was interested in, how was it that the Nazis even came into power to begin with? How is it that occurred? And in doing so, I, became, aware I had not known about the connections between the United States and Germany in the years leading up to the Third Reich. I mean, I had no idea that German eugenicists were, in dialogue with American eugenicists in the years leading up to the Third Reich. I had not known that. I had no idea that American eugenicists had written these books that were huge bestsellers in Germany in the years leading up to the Third Reich, and that not only were they bestsellers, but that the Nazis actually used these books that had been written by American eugenicists as in the curricula for students in the Nazi regime. And then, what I just could not have known and just was stunned to learn was that the Nazis actually sent researchers to the United States to study the Jim Crow caste system, to study the laws, the American jurisprudence that had subjugated African Americans. They sent people to study the anti-miscegenation laws. They sent people to study how America had identified and defined who could be in which race. These were things that they were very interested to understand. And it turned out that, of course, the Nazis needed no one to teach them how to hate. They absolutely did not need anyone to teach them how to hate, but they actually looked to the United States because at that time, there was no other, established, developed, long-standing jurisprudence that delineated on the basis of what the United States was doing at that point in terms of miscegenation and also in terms of definition of what the social construct, political construct known as race. And so that's why they sent researchers, and then they went back and discussed and debated those laws as they were considering and shaping what would ultimately become the Nuremberg laws. So that, discovering all those things, that was where I kept it to those three, because ultimately this book is by an American, for Americans, about America at a moment of great existential crisis. And this is a way to understand ourselves through the lens of new language that allows us to see what we otherwise could not see, to see the points of intersection so that somehow we could perhaps learn from these other places and then transcend them in a way that the United States is known for setting trends and for being on the forefront of innovation. And one would hope that the United States could lead the world in finding a way to finally transcend these embedded hierarchies.
Thank you for a great question and a great answer. This next question is from Sarah. Can you speak about the overlap of the caste system and patriarchy?
Well, I think I would just say, yes, it exists. I mean, that's, the thing is, the metric is primarily as the colonists were devising it, they were, using phenotype, the superficial, presumably neutral physical characteristics that just are a sign of human variation. They turned that into a social structure in which what a person looked like was the prime determinant of what they could do in society. But of course, on top of that was patriarchy, was the male primacy. Because of course males in the dominant caste are the ones who had whatever rights anyone had, they would have all those rights, and of course that meant that they had domination over everyone else, including men of the subordinated group, and of course women of either of the groups, and they took tremendous advantage of the women. As we know, it's one of the reasons why African Americans look like a rainbow, because of the tremendous abuse and rape of enslaved women. So that absolutely is a part of caste. You could say that gender is yet another metric that is a determinant of, or historically has been a determinant of, where one is valued in a caste system, which is thus leads us to this idea of intersectionality, the idea that you can have various characteristics that, once they are all combined into an individual, could together determine how a person is received or perceived wherever they might be.
Well, and I thought what was so interesting, there were a lot of different stories that you tell in the book where the subjects are Black women. I think of, the Black women on the wine tour train in Napa Valley, Black women in motion, Black women in places where we're not supposed to be, where we're not expected, the going from one place to the next and being recognized intensely as being, pollutants or out of place. That was very striking to me across the book. Yeah. Is there one more question, Caroline?
Yeah, I think we have time for one last question, and this is, I think, a good one to end on. It's anonymous, but they ask, I feel like reading your books has changed me. How did writing and sharing them change you?
That is a really great question. I've lived with this, idea about caste for such a long time. I mean, going back to the research for The Warmth of the Suns, and The Warmth of the Suns I worked on for so long that I say that if it were a human being, it would be in high school and dating. I worked on it for 15 years. So if it were a human being, in high school and dating. So I've lived with this for a very long time. And I would say that my, how I'm feeling now, I mean, the book has only been out for 3 months, so I'm still processing what I've written. But I would say, overall that, anyone who's spent a lot of time with me or knows me very, very well, particularly in the last few years, would know that this has been something that I've been talking about for a long time. They might just talk for a good amount of time about whatever it may be, and then they'd say, okay, here she goes talking about caste again, because that is what I was doing. It was, when you're working on a book, it's you immerse yourself in it, and it's like always in your mind. You're always thinking about it. It's always in the back of your mind, no matter whatever's going on. And so, the idea of this, to speak to what, the questioner was saying, is that, this is a kind of thing where once you see it, you can't unsee it. Like once and once it starts to click, then it's hard to not know. It changes the way you see everything. I mean, that's what it did for me. And so one of the things I really wanted to do was to get this out of me. I wanted to get this out to the world. I wanted people to be able to at least have the chance to engage with what I had come to learn in the course of the research that I did. And I wanted people to be able to see some of the things that, again, like the X-ray, once you have seen the X-ray and you know what it looks like, then you sort of feel like you have kind of X-ray vision. So many things begin to make sense. I mean, so many things that otherwise seem to defy explanation seem to finally click into place. And that was what I wanted other people to experience. And I think that is what's happening with this book. But I think I feel tremendous unburdening. I feel a tremendous sense of being able to get this out into the world. They don't say that you deliver a book, in the way you deliver a baby. It's kind of, in some ways, it feels like delivering this out and getting this out there. And it allows me to be able to know that I'm giving other people a chance to experience and to know the things that I had discovered. And I hope, really truly hope, this book is, a lot of people say, she's making this argument and she's trying to make this case, but it really isn't. I mean, I don't argue anyway. I'm just not a person who argues. This book is a prayer for our country. It is a prayer for our country. And I hope that we can somehow transcend these artificial, human constructed divisions so that we can now move forward, not just for the sake of, of our communities and our country, but for the species and the planet.
Well, I am so grateful to you for the generosity of this conversation. I am so grateful to you for all of your work. I'm so grateful to you for this book. Again, it's doing its work, and it's only the beginning. And there are so many conversations that we need to have that it will help us have. And so for that, I thank you deeply.
Thank you.
My friend.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander, as well, for leading a fantastic conversation and for all of your contributions to literature. Thank you both for your time tonight. And please, everyone listening, watching, if you haven't read the book yet, please go buy it. Caste. We have the link in the chat, and share them, get them for your friends this holiday season. And we hope you'll join us for the rest of the Winter Words season. Next up is Curtis Sittenfeld on December 15th. Thanks for joining again. Stay well, everyone, and good night.